Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram, former senior British military intelligence officer and now global commentator on geopolitics, defence, security and lots of other things. Now, we'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio experts' analysis. And we've got three fantastic discussions that I'm going to point you to this week. But what has happened in Ukraine? I think there are three things that are going on. We're seeing more maneuvering in the international geopolitical domain, in particular between Trump and people understanding where Trump's position is, Putin and trying to work out what the Trump-Putin relationship is, and then the Zelensky-Trump relationship in that, and the geopolitical implications of those on, in particular, the EU. And the EU has been sitting down trying to discuss its position when it comes to support for Ukraine and where that's likely to go. And we're seeing some interesting comments coming out, including the UK leading a group that is going to look at wider support to Ukraine from the EU members of NATO, and a number of other different positions going on, but again, without understanding exactly where Trump's going to go and what Putin's reaction is going to be to that in particular. I think our international leaders are remaining slightly confused is probably the wrong word, but they're looking at all of their options. Getting a bit closer to home to the conflict inside Ukraine itself, tactically in the east, the Russians continue to advance, but very, very slowly indeed, and at huge cost. They're still losing between 1,400 and 1,600 troops a day. That's dead or severely wounded. They're losing tens of pieces of armoured equipment a day, and that's unsustainable. The Ukrainians continue to attack Russian critical oil infrastructure and other infrastructure. And in the Kursk region, where the Ukrainians came in, they have counterattacked the Russian counterattacks, and there's still a degree of stalemate. But the significant piece of news coming out of there seems to be that the North Koreans have been withdrawn from the close contact fight to regroup again, to potentially retrain and possibly get reinforced. We don't know that there's any reinforcements coming in yet, but that's all down to the fact that they have suffered huge casualties. Some interesting commentary around on how good the North Korean troops are, and it seems that they are fit soldiers who can shoot well, but their tactics are shockingly bad, and they cannot understand how modern battlefields and modern battle space works, and therefore suffer whenever they are hit from multiple angles with different weapon systems. And in particular, the FPV UAVs have had a devastating effect on them. And again, when that is combined with accurate artillery fire, that is what has caused huge numbers of casualties. The North Koreans refuse to get captured, and it seems that the tactics are with them, with their commanders, and with the Russian commanders that are around, that anyone that could be captured gets killed or put in a position where they are killed by the Ukrainians rather than a position where they've been captured. So we'll see when the North Koreans come back into the fight again, because I think it's when. Now, of our videos today, of the three, the first one is former NATO spokesman Jamie Shea. I've known Jamie for many, many years from when we were in the Balkans together. And he gets into a very interesting video where he's talking about how much the Ukrainians have actually achieved when you look at the conflict.
You could point out that all is not lost for Ukraine. We're going into the fourth year in a couple of weeks of the war. They're still there. Very few people predicted that at the beginning. They've shown that they're plucky, when it comes to assassinating Russian generals on the streets of Moscow, or, sending drones to blow up petrochemical or oil refineries in Russia, forcing the Russian ships out of the Black Sea. And they've inflicted severe losses on the North Koreans, so much so that the North Koreans have now basically stopped fighting. And at least for the time being have been taken out of the front line. But those tactical successes, although good to boost Ukrainian morale, unfortunately can't camouflage the big strategic picture, which is the Ukrainians are losing territory. They're having trouble raising their army. They started the war with 11 million soldiers that they could mobilize, and they've used up 7.4 million in mobilization, or people they can't use, people who've gone abroad. So they haven't got much of reserve capacity left. And of course, they are dealing now with a generation of people who don't want to fight. Because they see all too well the reality of war. And of course, they see the Trump administration and the prospect that they'll be receiving less aid. The real danger, I think, Lewis, in a nutshell, is if the Russians do get to Pokrovsk, the objective they're trying to get to at the moment in Donetsk, a slow grinding advance could suddenly turn into a very quick advance. A bit like the end of the First World War, where the Allies advanced very slowly, and then suddenly the German lines started to collapse, and all of a sudden the Allies were advancing very quickly, and the war came to an end. This is because the territory is flat. You've got lots of big strategic objectives. You've got roads, railway lines that the Russians could potentially exploit. So they could actually get to the middle of Ukraine in a fraction of the time that it's taken them to go do 65 miles from Bakhmut a couple of years ago in eastern Ukraine to Pokrovsk, where they are today. So there is a bit of a danger there for the Ukrainians that if the Russians suddenly get hold of these important strategic objectives. But again, if providing the Ukrainians continue to receive military assistance, they can keep themselves in the fight and continue to exact a very high price on Russia. On the other hand, the good news for Ukrainians is that the Russian economy is now showing the strain. 30% inflation, declining ruble, for instance, hitting people quite hard, and that could force Putin to stop the war, particularly if the oil price goes down. But the question is can those sanctions be made to work before Ukraine is so exhausted that it simply has to give up the fight?
And you mentioned just a moment ago there the North Korean troops that are fighting in the Kursk salient. You said they are now largely out of the fight. How has that come about?
They've taken big losses. Zelensky may be exaggerating sometimes, like anybody who's a commander in war tends to sort of play down losses, exaggerate successes. But I think the conventional wisdom of the intelligence community is that nonetheless the North Koreans have suffered badly. They have not had much air cover or back up from the Russian forces. They're terrified of surrendering, and in many cases have committed suicide. They haven't been adequately prepared for this kind of conflict, and the Russians have now sort of basically taken them out of the front line and seeing what kind of rear, logistic kind of jobs that they can give to them in Kursk. Certainly, the addition of these North Koreans has not enabled Russia to sort of sweep the Ukrainians out of the Kursk salient in the way that they would have hoped. I mean, they had some initial successes, but the Ukrainians now at least seem to be holding on quite well. Now, what will that mean? Will they ask for more North Koreans, simply to sort of flood the numbers? Or will they basically say to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, no, don't bother sending me more troops. We'll simply do a deal that you can continue to supply us with ammunition and missiles, and we'll give you satellite technology and oil and food in exchange. So that's going to be a good question. But the North Koreans certainly don't seem to have had the success that the Wagner or the Chechen sort of mercenary forces that Russia has been using quite extensively have had, particularly, for example, in the capture of Bakhmut a year ago.
And goes into the fact that they have stopped the Russians from a strategic perspective meeting their original objectives 3 years ago. They have held back one of the largest military forces on paper in the world for almost 3 years in the fight in the east, and defeated their main objectives and forced them to go on to subsequent objectives. Jamie, as he goes through his discussion, mixes up a little bit, and I will say this to him next time we meet him, the operations at the tactical level, the fighting in the east, the fighting day to day in Kursk, with operations at the operational level, the actual incursion into Kursk, the Ukrainian attacks against oil fields and oil refineries, the Ukrainian attacks against logistic bases across Russia, the Ukrainian assassinations of Russian generals, and then the strategic impact and where that's having. But this is something that, as a military planner, I become very doctrinally pure about it. And that's why when I hear commentators mix it up slightly, I cringe a lot. And he brings out the fact of the North Koreans, which was a strategic tactic brought in at the operational level to fight tactically. But there are strategic implications of another nation coming in to support Russia. They've been effectively defeated tactically and have had to withdraw to regroup. Jamie's got some good discussion on whether he thinks they're going to come back in again. I'll let you watch it and make your mind up, but Jamie's always well worth listening to. So our next video is from Mark Galotti, and Mark takes a very interesting stance. It's something that I don't think we discuss enough to put the decision making into context. And he talks about Putin's understanding or Putin's desire and looking back at Russia when it was the old Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union created in 1945, and says Russia is not the old USSR of 1945.
This is how both men really think the world is handled. That it's about the big powers, the great powers, dividing things between them. The irony is, of course, that Russia is not the Soviet Union in 1945. It is not a global superpower. It's not even really a great power. Yes, it has nuclear weapons, but unless all you want to do is blow up the world, that's a very limited value. In practical terms, on almost any index, Russia is no longer in a position to be able to divide the world. But nonetheless, that's how Putin thinks Russia should be considered. And so, Putin is going to continue to try and push this idea that, well, we, the Americans, and maybe the Chinese, we should be allowed to get together and decide whatever global issue matters to us.
And this kind of hubris, you believe, may be the undoing, in a way, of Putin, in that he may overplay his hand in any upcoming meetings with Donald Trump. What is the fear amongst those close to him? Yeah,
the fear is that at the moment, Putin particularly is looking quite cocky. He's seeing his forces continue to slowly grind forward in Ukraine. He's seeing all sorts of divisions in the West. And there is that sense that a man who clearly enjoys mind games and petty exercises of power, remember, this is a man who kept the Pope waiting for an hour. This is a man who, again, as I mentioned in the article, knowing that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs, nonetheless, brought his great big Labrador into the room. This is really playground stuff, but nonetheless, clearly Putin gets a kick out of that. And the fear, and this is something I actually had from speaking to someone who back in the day had actually briefed Putin early in his presidential career, and was saying the thing about Putin nowadays is 25 years in power, he thinks he knows it all, he thinks it knows it better than everyone else, and that he may well not listen to his briefers and precisely try some kind of little petty one-upmanships with Trump, exactly the sort of thing that Trump would respond badly to. And the thing is that whereas the Biden administration was quite cautious, the sense is that if Trump turns against Russia, then all bets will be off.
And what do you think he's capable of if Trump does turn against Russia?
Well, again, there's what Trump's initial impulse would be, and there will be what, in some ways, the Pentagon and the rest of the machine would allow him to do. I think in practice, what we would just simply see is not just a lot more assistance being provided to Ukraine, but all the old limitations on how Ukraine could use these missiles and other systems taken away. So basically, more or less Trump egging on the Ukrainians to do their worst, but also sabotage. The Ukrainians carry out campaigns of sabotage. We might well find a lot of more CIA assistance for that.
So really what President Zelensky should be hoping for is that Putin does exactly that and overplays his hand with Donald Trump and annoys him so that he actually supports Ukraine more.
Yeah, and certainly that's something that we are getting now from various Ukrainian officials and commentators and so forth. There is that sense that although at first there was quite a lot of dismay about Trump's election in Kyiv, because Trump and Zelensky do not have a good relationship. And at the moment, the decision by the American administration to suddenly block all sort of non-military aid programs is clearly also having quite a serious impact in Ukraine itself. But nonetheless, there is that sense that whereas Biden stood for, in a way, slow, measured defeat, with Trump, it's much more of a, toss a coin. Heads we lose, tails we win, but basically there is a chance that, frankly, they didn't think, certainly in the last year or so, the Biden administration was giving them.
So where do you see this going in the next, the ensuing 5 years or so?
Well, I mean, in terms of Putin, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think he's going anywhere. I mean, this is a system which is built really to ensure that there can be no real challenge to the leader. So many overlapping and competing security apparatuses that balance each other. Very hard to have a political coup against him. Likewise, incredibly hard for any kind of public organization, unless there's something really that starts to sort of shatter. Instead, this is a bit like the old days of the Brezhnev's Soviet Union back in the 1970s, just in fast forward, slow, shabby slide down into stagnation and such like. I think really we're all just waiting for that day when Putin doesn't wake up. And that's where we're at.
And goes on to explain why he thinks Russia is no longer a global power or the global power that it thinks it is. He explains how Putin still thinks that it's him with the Chinese, with the Americans that effectively set the world order, and that's what he desires within a global power. And some very interesting discussion points around that. I'll let you watch Mark's video. But he then goes on to explain how he's not sure whether Putin actually is being briefed about the reality of what's going on, has got an understanding of the reality of the real position of where Russia is at the moment, rather than that being an ambition to recreate the old USSR where he becomes the Tsar, the center of it, and whether he understands the reality of that being impossible for him to achieve, and thinks that he's probably sitting in a position of wider groupthink or self-inflicted groupthink, where he believes that he can still achieve that. And therefore reality of what is going on around the world is being kept from him. And this will translate into the relationship that there is between Trump and Putin. And we've already seen some elements to that. And he thinks that Putin will start to be quite petty with Trump if he's not getting the way that Putin thinks his negotiations with Trump should go. And all that'll do is it will anger Donald Trump, and it's likely that Donald Trump will become petty in his response back again. But Putin hasn't had this before. He hasn't had this from the Biden administration. He hasn't had anyone putting that real pressure on him. And if it gets into that petty game, Trump's response is likely to be the removal of restrictions on use of longer range weapons for Zelensky, supplying the Ukrainians more weapon systems and supporting them to give Putin, in effect, a further bloody nose to try and convince him that he can't win and push him back to Trump's way of thinking. I think what Mark is saying through his whole video, in effect, is 2025 is going to be a very interesting year as we see the game playing out between Putin with his post-1945 USSR ambitions for Russia, and Trump with his desire to make sure that that never happens again and that the war actually ends. Zelensky is playing a very clever game by playing Donald Trump and giving him what he thinks he wants Donald Trump to hear, and putting strong messages out about the position of the West and what would be acceptable to Zelensky if it came down to any peace deal. And I think within that acceptability, it's going to be an awful lot more than a written agreement with written security guarantees, because of course we had that with Budapest beforehand, where United States, United Kingdom and Russia all signed up to give Ukraine security guarantees, and it hasn't been followed. So an interesting time to come up, and Mark's video is definitely well worth watching. And the final one I want to highlight this week, because he's talking about one of my heroes of the Ukrainian conflict, is a video interview with Robert Fox, the defense correspondent. And there's not a lot that Robert doesn't know or understand about geopolitical issues when it comes to defense-related issues around the world. And he's talking about my hero, that's General Budanov, who's the head of the HUR, the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence.
I read General Budanov into this. I think there is some really smart, I fear, Machiavellian minds at the top in Kiev. Keep them on their toes. It's very interesting, as you say, that they've picked out a Chechen leader in a particular area of marginal warfare. You know, there is a great fear that exotic means. We're seeing it at sea, what is really going on with the cables. It's very interesting how the Swedes have pulled back and say, oh, no, it's just bad navigation when one of the cables was lifted. One of the things, by the way, I must say that they fear in exotic warfare is that they will use chemicals. And I think that this accounts for the latest, and it's a warning. Budanov he's the director of intelligence, but he's really very, very close to Syrskyi at the top, and it has been running a formidably fascinating and very, very chilling propaganda war. And he is the master of psyops. And this is a psychological operation. The Chechens, we know, have been very important to Putin personally. And I think this also may be sending a little message saying we're getting quite close to you. It's quite interesting that the front is moving inexorably, but not very fast. But it's the psychology is still there. And part of the game is that we do hold a lot of cards, and there's a message to Trump about all of this, whether it's rare earth elements, whether it's the psychological campaign, whether it's the ingenuity in the close and the deep air war. They're saying to Trump particularly, don't count us out. You can't settle this by talking to Putin. You've got to talk to us. And that is what Zelensky is saying. And that's where there is the big battleground at the moment, because I think the Europeans will be saying that to Trump. You cannot do a fireside chat settlement. Look at the disaster of the two Minsk agreements. They never came to anything. And a lot of what Putin is proposing is a retread of the Minsk agreements. No NATO, neutrality, disarmament, get rid of Zelensky, give us the territory we've got, and a little bit more. Zelensky, he is in difficulty, but when he's looking at nearly 100,000 Russian troops being lost, killed, wounded, whatever, every 2 months at the moment, he knows things aren't looking too good in Moscow either.
And the tactics that Budanov's having, and tying those tactics in with the Ukrainian General Staff Commander, General Syrskyi, so that he's getting the SOE operations that Budanov is executing throughout Russia, the sabotage operations, the assassination operations, the attacking Russian oil infrastructure and refining infrastructure and storage infrastructure, attacking Russian military airfields, attacking railway lines, logistic dumps and command and control centers, tying that in with what General Syrskyi is trying to achieve from a tactical perspective. And very much so, Robert comes in and describes this as exotic warfare. And I love that phrase. I hadn't heard it before. And that exotic warfare describes perfectly with what's going on. And it's working the exotic warfare side alongside the conventional warfare. So Budanov, the leader of the exotic side, if that doesn't sound a little suggestive, with Syrskyi, the leader of the conventional side, working the two of them together, and the Russians don't know where to maneuver, and that's hitting them really quite well. Here we've got some very clear pictures of the Ukrainian successful attacks on Russian refineries, and what we see are the flames coming up from oil storage sites. Now, the Ukrainians are not just hitting the oil storage sites, which has a significant impact on Russia's ability to pump oil out of the ground and then get that oil into its refineries. It's hitting the refineries. So Russia is getting to capacity in its oil storage sites. That capacity is being reduced through the Ukrainian attacks, very successful as we can see here, hundreds if not thousands of kilometers from Ukrainian front line. And then the ability to refine any oil that is there and export that is being impacted as well. Very, very successful. This is undermining Russia's ability to continue to economically support its war with Ukraine. And Robert goes on to say that we're seeing some change in NATO as well. And under the new NATO Secretary General, seems to have understood the fact that with Donald Trump coming in, NATO needs to have a reset in its approach to Ukraine, where it's more of a European members of NATO take a greater lead. And he's taking a greater lead in that, in the commentary that he's putting out from NATO and on behalf of NATO. He's talked of 3% of GDP as being the new target for NATO members and the new requirement for them to as part of their membership. That's 3% of GDP spent on defence. It's currently 2%. Trump has mentioned 5%, but that's in Trump terms a negotiating position. I say this fairly frequently, we live in interesting times and that continues. So that's a recap of events for this week. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to put your comments below and we'll try and deal with those in the Q&A sessions that we do each week. And sign up, please, for Times Radio membership for more exclusive content. Thank you. I'm Philip Ingram and goodbye.